I am your facilitator today. So my name is Louisa Burwood-Taylor. I'm head of media research for AgFunder. We're an investor and a media organization all around food and agriculture technology. And we've been around since 2012. So I'm really excited to be doing this conversation with you all today. I'll just wait a little bit longer for Helen, Delphine, Mathilde, if you can hear us. Maybe you can turn your cameras on. Okay, Mathilde is your assistant. Sounds good.
Hello, Louise. I'm just here
there.
for technical matters, so
perfect.
I'm here, but I will be on the background.
Brilliant. Okay, so I think is that everyone? Just Helen, hoping she will turn her camera on soon, but maybe we can kick things off before maybe she stepped away. So as you all probably know, our topic of conversation for today is what role can policy and governance play in accelerating the transition to regenerative agriculture, and what areas can it be most effective? So we've got three main questions that we want to dig into today, and provide some pretty clear talking points, some outcomes. We want to identify the challenges for each of these questions. We want to outline some of the opportunities, and we want to provide solutions. And as it was outlined earlier, these are going to be presented to the UN and hopefully can be action items. So our questions are, what role can policy and governance play in accelerating transition? Is there anything currently getting in the way? And what are the key next steps to be taken to ensure policy change and governance can support the accelerated transition to regenerative agriculture? So I think the best way for us to start would be for everyone to introduce themselves and perhaps kick off with some initial thoughts around the overall topic for today. So let's start, whoever's on the top of my screen, Javier Ruiz.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Maybe one thing that just to look at it from a much wider perspective, because now we are just after the rush of the common agricultural policy reform, and that many of us have been following, etc. But maybe to look a little bit wider, I think it's good to do so at the beginning. I think that
Can you say who you are? Sorry, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So Javier Ruiz, working for WWF in the European Policy Office in Brussels. Sorry. So some initial thoughts would be, what we notice, not only in Europe, but elsewhere in the world. When you're discussing with all the projects we do on the ground, and we are looking at the challenges that farmers are facing to adopt, let's say, more regenerative practices. The question is not so much whether it's agronomically possible to do it or whether you can really do it. In terms of technically, it's possible. The big challenge is, in most cases, is more socioeconomic wise. The challenge is, how can I do that and still remain competitive, still be able to continue my farming business while adopting more sustainable practice. And I think that's where we need to look, not only, and I think that's where the big picture that we need to take is in what circumstances or what socioeconomic context are farmers operating, and what are the elements that make the transition possible or not. Because we may spend a lot of time justifying or finding, scientific basis, saying, oh, this is possible, you can do this, this can improve your whatever, and there's many elements there, but the bottom line is there. And therefore, one of the bottlenecks that we are facing very, very strongly is that, of course, we are operating in a very, very, very competitive environment. And therefore, very quickly, if you adopt practices that do not meet certain requirements that allow you to keep farming and keep farming in a profitable way, obviously, the adoption of all that is challenging. And therefore, the question is, do we need to look at, regulatory measures, or what type of? There's multiple levers that we could look at. Not only let's say the funding support that the EU is providing to farmers through the CAP, which is a very important one. I won't challenge that, of course, because I really strongly feel that there should be much more in support of going in that direction. But there are other constraints and other policies that we maybe need to look at more carefully I mean, Paolo was working in the past also in the unfair trading practices. I mean, the trade issue is a very difficult one. How do we make it easier as a pathway for farmers to adopt? And the easiest one is to say, is it that the adoption of these practices is going to make their lives, I don't say simpler, but it's not going to be simple. I mean, the simplicity is not always it, but at least that they have a little bit of clarity that by moving in this direction, they are securing their income also for the upcoming years. Because for me, that's the thing that we frequently have as a challenge. And when we look, and I finish with this here, when we do some of the work as WWF on this topic, of course, there's opportunities because we go with we manage to differentiate a product. We get it a bit of a niche market with a bit of a higher price for the product, etc. And that works, but works to a certain extent. The big question is, how can we do that at a sufficient scale? And because you cannot have niche products everywhere, we have difficulties there. So how can we adopt approaches in terms of policy and regulation that will help this upscale at a sufficient degree? And I think that I leave it there for a moment. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. That's great. Helen, Mdina, can you introduce yourself and provide a short little introduction to your thinking?
Yeah, I was actually taking a lot of notes because I found that to be very interesting. So I'm Helen Mdina with the Nestle Public Affairs team. And I mean, it's absolutely right. The issue here is, how do we help in the just transition for farmers, right? So that's the big question. And that's why I'm really interested in this space, because we're trying to understand how we work with our farmers to do that. Now, one of the ways we're going to do it is obviously through the consumers. And some of the areas is educating consumers about our regenerative agriculture practices and how they are forming and helping the base for our nutritious products. We're doing plant-based products that are based on regenerative agriculture practices. So that's what we're doing, but that is kind of a premium price, obviously, and it's different. So I'm really interested in what Javier just said, and this is why it's a really important subject for us here. Is we need things that are just not premium. We need to make it more mainstream. We need the cost to be reflected, and we want to be securing farmers in this practice. We want to be able to buy that product from them. So that's just my thought, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Tiglet, Aslan.
Hi, Tiglet Aslan, representing Indigo Agriculture, a ag-tech company, among other things, focusing on carbon farming, sequestering carbon in mineral soil, and currently working on rolling out a model for carbon farming. And I want to first of all, thank you for having the opportunity to join this group. To put it straightforward, from our experience working directly with growers, the transition to agriculture, to regenerative agriculture, comes at a cost, and it's not only being motivated to do it, but also being incentivized financially and finding ways to do the transition. So from our point of view, it would be one part of the solution would be to, if we talk about policy and policy framework, it would be to set up an environment that supports, I would say, public-private partnerships that can provide funds and financial resources that can help growers to make the transition to regenerative agriculture.
Great, thank you very much. Emil.
Hello, I'm Emil Frison. I'm a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, and I've been dealing with agroecology and regenerative agriculture for a good part of my career. I think since this group is also more focusing on the policy and governance aspects, I want to start by saying that one of the major problems is that so far we've had disconnected policies or contradicting policies between different sectors, and that in the agricultural sector, the main objective remained increasing productivity, In the environmental sector, we have policies that are in contradiction with agriculture, and the same for health. So one of the important transformations that we need is moving towards integrated food policies that bring together agriculture, environment, health, social affairs, trade, etc., so that we have are able to provide the kind of incentives and disincentives to push our production system towards a more sustainable one. And that will involve what has already been mentioned, true cost accounting. We are not paying the true cost of food, as we all know. The tremendous cost to the environment and to health is not accounted for now. So if we are taking a longer term perspective and reallocate resources to be more preventive and creating a production system that will also cost less to the health sector and the environment sector, the savings that we are making on that side can be re-injected into the production systems to become more sustainable. I think there is evidence about the economic feasibility, some recent papers that come out from Europe about agroecological approaches that are between 10% and 110% more economically performing than conventional ones. I think one of the major problems also on why things are not moving is that farmers to a large extent are essentially getting their advice now from input suppliers. And therefore, there is very little independent advice provided. And of course, input suppliers have a vested interest in continuing to sell inputs. So I think that is an issue that needs to be addressed as well, providing independent advice to accompany farmers, not just as passive recipients of technologies or approaches, but as co-innovators. And just to conclude my first introduction, Janusz Potashnik mentioned the two major crises that we have, being climate and biodiversity. But the third major crisis is certainly a social one. And farmers are not being rewarded properly for their hard work. The example of France, where about half of the farmers are getting €350 per month as an income, which is the third of the minimum wage. This is just not acceptable for people that work often 7 days a week and 10 hours or more a day. So I think it's a need for a more radical rethinking of our policy framework towards an integrated food system policy that is able to rebalance things. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Great, thank you. Lots of useful points there. Nora Hiller.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Nora Hiller. I work for the Institute of European Environmental Policy, especially in the land use and climate area. And yeah, there also I work a lot with European policy, and on regenerative agriculture. There are lots of policies that link to the topic. From to fork was already mentioned, biodiversity, and also soil strategy, which needs to be revised now. And yeah, we must consider all of these when we talk about the topic. But it's also important that I think policies not only focus solely on targets, but also to find ways in creating strategies for sustainable agriculture, to make methods available and to link subsidies and also to these, and find what works for the environment and for farmers, and also link there the importance of the governments of data collection, especially when we talk about soil. I also liked very much from the introductory speech the point on innovation, where we must also think about innovation for system, which with regenerative agriculture is very important, and to really think about how we can utilize and better implement a science practitioner policy interface.
Great, thank you very much, Nora. Pierre. Hi, Pierre.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. So Pierre Basco, I'm director in charge of sustainability and income support in DG Agri, so European Commission. So you have already mentioned, I think, the CAP and the ongoing negotiation, or at least the finalization of the negotiation of the future policy framework. So I will not elaborate on that. I would like to make maybe 4 points, I think, to the first introduction. The first one is that it is true that I think we are facing a crisis, I think a climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, etc. But just I would like to bring a bit of a more positive tone. I think a lot of efforts have been done by our farmers. A lot of things are taking place. A lot of changes are taking place in the farming community, and I would say in society at large. And in my view, I think the key challenge for us would be, I think, to accelerate quite drastically, I think, the pace of these changes, of this adaptation, in order to, because it's a race against time, as we have heard before. So, but I would like to say that I think we need to build already on what currently exists. Second point I would like to make, and this is, I think it's Emil who has already said that, and it has been said also by others, that I think we need to rethink radically, I think, the way I think we are doing policy, at least at EU level. And here I will not speak, I think, as a Commission official, but as a long experience person, I think, working in farm policy. We really need to broaden, I think, the policy perspective from a purely, primary sector-oriented policy towards, I think, a policy covering, I think, the whole food system. Because, and many have said that, whatever we do at the level of the farming sector, if the industry, that does not get involved, if the consumers don't change the dietary pattern and the way I think they consume food product, or the way they consume in general, this will be lost effort, and it will not work. So we need to look at a much more integrated way. We spent the last 50 years, trying to address socioeconomic objectives at the expense, I think, on the environment, if I simplify a bit. And now my fear is that we are going to try to achieve, environment and climate objectives at the expense, I think, of the economic situation of farmers and all economic agents, and at very high social cost. And I think the Gilets jaunes, phenomenon that we have seen in France, and I would say, I think, the rise, I think, of the extremes, in the political spectrum in Europe, I think, is quite, I think, represent a major risk, and I think, and we need to take that into account. We need to have, it's easy to say, it's more difficult to do, but we need to have, an integrated and very inclusive, I think, approach to this policy change. Third point I would like to say is that we need also to have a change in mindset, because we know a lot about regenerative agriculture, about conservation agriculture, agroecology, agroforestry, you name it. There's a lot of research, a lot of knowledge have been developed and are being diffused, I think, in the farm sector. But we shouldn't forget that farmers, but also consumers, have been used, I think, to produce. Have been taught to produce in a certain way. I come from an agronomy school, in France, and I think this is what we were taught in the 70s and 80s. Consumers are used to consume, I think, certain products, etc. So we need really, not talking about the industry, we need to change, I think, the mindset of society, not only of farmers, but also the industry and consumers, and to have, different perspective and different relation to nature. This is absolutely fundamental. And the last point I would like to mention is that we need, and this has already been underlined, I think, by some colleagues this afternoon, is that we need to better accompany farmers. There's a lot of very good advisory services, in Western Europe, much less good in Eastern member states, because as one of you have mentioned that, I think they're in the hand, I think, of the input suppliers. But I think we need to really improve, I think, the the availability and the quality, I think, of advisors for the farm sector. We know how to do. I'm responsible in my directorate, I think, for improving and using, Copernicus images, promoting robotics, etc. We know a lot. I think, with Internet of Things, we have access to a lot of new knowledge, new technologies. We can do much more, but we need to diffuse that, and we need to help farmers. And farmers, very often, somebody said that they work 12 hours a day. They don't have direct access, I think, to all these new practices, new techniques, etc. So we need to develop tools in order for them to better understand what is the status of the natural resources that they use, biodiversity on the land parcel, the quality of the soil, etc., the water they use, what is the impact that their activity has on natural resources. And we need to be able to relate that, I think, to a change in practices. And if we manage to do that, and because I do believe that this is possible, but this requires a huge investment, not only from the public, but also from the private sector. If we manage to show to farmers that changing practices can work, and they will be accompanied and supported with financial incentive for that, I do believe that I think farmers will do it because they're entrepreneurs. And I think, and we can see that, I think, in other sectors, in the energy sector, some industry change, I think, of sector, of product that they sell, of services that they provide, because they know that in the future is somewhere else. And we need to do the same, I think, for the farming sector. So this provision of advisory services and the provision of tools that can help farmers better manage the farm by having access to better information is critical. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Helen. Hi, Helen. Can you just give yourself a quick introduction and some first thoughts on the topic?
Yes, hi, and apologies for having to come in late, but quite a few things overran. My name is Helen Papper. I am the Director of Global Communications and Advocacy for the International Fund for Agricultural Development, which is a specialized niche agency of the UN with the development hat, as well as an international funding institution hat. And so I'm very happy to be here with you. I wanted to focus a little bit on the particular aspect, since we're talking also about policy, about the particular aspect of having to really speed up rural development and look at ways to make sure that we have agile financial mechanisms that can actually reach the most remote area, and in particular, the smallholder farmers. I think smallholder farmers, as we've realized, are actually key to strengthening our food systems and connecting the dots to stronger nutrition and therefore stronger health across the world. And so it's very important to look at how we can do that. And one of the ways that has been identified, and one of the ways forward, is specifically to look at bringing together public development banks and making sure that the money that they already have is rechanneled to specifically address the funding gaps that we are seeing in terms of the possibility to increase and speed up the development as far as smallholder farmers are concerned. And then within that, I think there's also a crucial aspect that is often left behind, which has to do with focusing on smallholder women farmers in rural communities in the developing world that should be the norm. But the opposite is true for now. They're more often than not told to work unpaid still today. They're deprived of access to markets. And even among the millions of smallholder farmers whose lives are primarily ignored, that represents an utterly invisible constituency. And it is quite astonishing that still today smallholder farmers suffer disproportionately from levels of hunger and deep poverty, even though there are 500 million or so farms are responsible for feeding more than half of humanity. And women especially are deprived of access to markets, capital assets, excluded from decision making. And there is a profound desperation that women smallholders in parts of Africa endure and that's ominous. They're hindered by bad policy, by political invisibility, the absence of fundamental rights. And so I think that closing the gender gap requires a moral will and fundamental action that goes from the advocacy that we're seeing to concrete solutions. And that is very much linked also to local realities and engages them in dialogue. I think one of the things that we've realized today is that despite a strong development humanitarian nexus across the UN and other multilaterals, it's failed because it has not been adapted to local realities in engaging the people themselves so that they can apply the solutions that really pertain to them. Communities around the world have an amazing resilience, and having lived in most of my life in most of these remote communities, South Sudan and Mali and Afghanistan, and these rural communities, and seeing how much knowledge they have to share to actually bridge the gap and speed up development, but not having the opportunity to share that knowledge, I think is a tremendous issue that we also need to deal with when we're looking at influencing policy and making sure that the funding of programs that should be long-term development programs incorporate their particular knowledge. I mean, as it stands today, women small holders are systematically neglected, like I've said. Even though more than 60% of all employed women in sub-Saharan Africa work in agriculture. And so guaranteeing land rights, I think, is critical, and that needs to be included in the discussions that we're having. Particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, women are not entitled to own land, but must access it through a male relative, a husband, a brother, a father. And so under these arrangements, women landholders are subject to the whims of fate and of men. And there's a lot to do with that. The problems are more profound, I think, than the fundamental issues of land rights alone. Women need access to basics such as seeds, fertilizers, farming equipment, without which their work is made even more challenging. And they also need to be encouraged to participate in agricultural extension services to improve their farming practices, be granted the same funding and credit opportunities as men. So as we currently right now work on making a call for the public development banks to come together to address this, I think that particular aspect needs to be addressed to ensure that the funding actually gets to that particular niche of the population. Development agencies, NGOs, as you know, have begun designing women-focused financial services and programs to improve the agricultural input accesses. And we just need to make sure that we take this further. And we've seen this with the COVID-19 pandemic, that this is becoming an urgency even more so. It is critical to deal with this now to mitigate the current economic fallout, accelerate recovery process in rural areas, and alleviate this existing gender inequalities. If not, we're not going to be able to move the needle on this particular aspect, which is very much linked to the strengthening of our nutrition globally and addressing these global challenges, including climate change in particular. So that's my contribution.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, there's so much for us to cover, and we now have about 40 minutes left. And, you know, in the interest of creating 3 to 5 actionable and feasible solutions, that is our task today. And within our first, the first question, so what Mark here has, and Mark is our rapporteur, and he's going to be presenting what we talk about today later on. He has got, a sheet with these 3 questions, and he needs to fill in with the key points from each of those. But looking at the first one, which talks about what role can policy and governance play in accelerating the transition to regenerative agriculture, and in what areas can it be most effective? We have just spoken about such a broad range, right, of things. So we've talked about the acceleration of regenerative agriculture, how important it is for this. This is now, the time is now, this is urgent. So we need policy to accelerate this. We've talked about policy to reward farmers for their work. We've talked more about there needs to be maybe a radical reframing of policy. That's going even deeper. And I think that's really significant and important for us to share later. We've also talked about, involving consumers and doing this in a much more food systems way. So it's not just on the farm that we're creating policies for the farm. And then, Helen, as you've just added, it's also around much broader, for developing nations, around gender equality and land rights to enable this transition so that farmers are all on the same level, as well as others. So if we think about the questions, and within the framework that we're in, maybe there needs to be a complete rethinking of how policy is done, but how can policy be most effective? Like which of these ones that, which of those ways of introducing policy that you've all brought up, what could be most effective, like today as it stands?
I think there has to be a greater participation of the different stakeholders in policy making. That's the first thing. And that will allow also a better integration of the different parts of the value chain by involving the producers, the people in the middle of the chain, and the consumers in the processes. And these policy processes should happen not only at the national level, but also more at the local level, where it's easier to bring people around the table to discuss their environment. So I think a greater participation and inclusiveness in policy development processes is an important aspect.
But yeah, absolutely. But if I look like in the because you asked like currently, and if I look in the eco schemes of the CAP, then I would say this is like compared to that, this is one step forward and also forward thinking. Of course, it's not the complete system change, but it is also the first step or a step further to a system change and setting the right incentives to make the move, and also targeting regenerative agriculture practices and incentivizing. And I hope it's really an incentive for growers to pick up with the supported measures in the European eco schemes. But then it depends on the national level what actually will become a eco scheme. If I look into the German translation of the eco schemes, there are several measures on the list that a grower can pick up and make the first move, and then it's a question like how can we foster this? And I would totally agree that a grower wants to be part of a transition. He needs the financial resources to make the move, and that's very much related to securing income, but also to granting access to knowledge. I would also agree that a farmer, a grower, is also a landowner, a land manager, a entrepreneur. So he will always will have a sustainable thinking about managing his land. So if I look into the CEP today, then I would say with the eco schemes, the first move towards change and picking up the regenerative agriculture is made. Now it's the question, how can you speed up the process? And then again, I will never be tired of asking, like you can do so much with policy framework, but then you also have to build a frame that private investors, private initiatives, private actors can come in and help speed up the process. So it cannot only be policy framework, it is a framework, but then the question is how can private companies, private initiatives jump in and help speed up the process of facilitating and implementing regenerative agriculture. And I would say the eco schemes are a good first step, and now we have to build on that. And there's a role for the private market to support growers in making the transition, providing knowledge, accompanying them in the process, and creating a market for the actual product that is then made.
Yeah, well, if I can build on that you just mentioned, I think, well, on the one hand, markets are very smart and they are very reactive to certain things, but on the other aspects, they are very dumb. I mean, we know that markets are very dumb and that don't give the right signals, particularly on environmental terms. So that's why I think it's really important that we look it's a bit frustrating that farmers need to turn so much to the CAP when they really need to adopt more environmentally friendly practices. I mean, it's frustrating. It's only the public that needs to be there, and we don't do something about the markets. And I think that's here where I want to link with one topic, but one element that Emil also mentioned earlier. Is it the disincentives that we may need to start considering a little bit more? I mean, and then should we not also make it slightly more difficult for certain producers to do certain things? Because otherwise, we are going to get pulled out of the picture, because the strength of the market and the drive to do certain things is very, very strong, very, very strong. And the CAP, strong as it is, it has its limitation also. So, and that I think where I think it's important from a governance level, and particularly at the relevant scale, could be at more local scales, more regional, or even at the EU level. I think that one topic that we don't pay enough attention to is to whether we should set ourselves some limits as a society to say we cannot go beyond certain boundaries. If we look outside of the farming world, I mean, you say motor vehicles. We know that all the improvements in the efficiency of motor vehicles have been lost over the last few years because we have adopted more consuming vehicles. Like, I mean, the sports utility vehicles have been are the things that are being sold everywhere in Europe. All the improvements in the efficiency of the individual motors is lost because we are buying bigger cars. The same happens also. The same can happen also in the farm food world. We need to set ourselves some limits and say these are limits that are kind of ceilings which we shouldn't be going beyond, and we should start to be reworking our way down. It applies to things like emissions from the farming sector, not farming. Food and farming sector. Let's just speak as Pierre was also earlier saying. Let's look at it from a system perspective. Should set ourselves some limits? The same applies to key environmental boundaries. I mean, in terms of water use in a certain river basin. I mean, when we are exceeding, we are exceeding. There's not a matter of I'm going to do the irrigation a bit more efficiently. Okay, that's part of the solution, but you need to have strong governance to allow you to block, or not block in the sense of, in the positive sense, I think that I say, well, this is what as much as you can go, and try to narrow things down to us, so we start to become a bit more sustainable. Because in the absence of that, we may be looking at partial solutions, but the drive is going to be too strong and will overcome. I think it will really play against our objectives unless we put some limits. And maybe, I mean, just to a final word, of course, technology improvements, and Paulo de Castro mentioned them earlier. Okay, we can look at technology improvements, but can we do that in a way that the governance really ensures that is triggering the type of result that we are seeking? Because we've seen it with the GMOs. Have GMOs reduced some of the claims that they had of that they were going to change so radically and everything is going to get so much better with the GMOs? I mean, I'm sorry, but where's the evidence? Because, and I'm not saying that GMOs are necessarily bad. I mean, that we could have different.
Another topic, yeah.
but we are lacking the governance mechanisms to deliver the benefits, because otherwise they don't deliver. And I think that's something we need to look at a bit in an integrated way, so that really we achieve the type of change that we want to see.
I think this is a really good point around disincentives. And actually, most of my experience is from the US, but they have they have policies called ecosystem market services that farmers can actually generate some income if they practice certain practices, plant certain trees around their borders and so on. But the amount of farmers adopting those are actually declining, and so the incentive is actually not necessarily big enough than the current system and the current market. That they can do, just continuing doing as they're doing conventionally. So I think that a great idea about disincentives. Does anyone else have thoughts on that? Yeah.
Sorry, I would like to say three things. And in my view, I think we are living in a modern world, at least I think in Western Europe. And what is important, well, this is my personal view. I think if we look over the last 50 years, or over centuries, basically consumers were purchasing what farmers were producing, and for the last, in my view, for the last 10 to 20 years, the issue, I think, of food and food production has been, captured, I think, by the consumers, and this is a very good thing. And in my view, if we want farmers, the best incentive for farmers to change the practice is not, by giving, further, subsidies or public support, is to induce changes, I think, in the way I think we consume. And in my view, I think the first thing that I would like to promote in terms of, policy measure is to better valorize, I think, the efforts of that farmers do through, I think, the promotion of a product. Because when you buy a product, you don't know if it has been produced, by regenerative agriculture, by conservation agriculture, by precision farming or whatever. So what is the incentive for farmers? Farmers are entrepreneurs, they're economic agents, and they want to produce, I think, where for the market where they will get, I think, the best return. So we need to change by better valorizing the product that they produce, by educating consumers. And I can see I've got young kids. And increasingly, I think they're telling me, when we go to do our shopping, don't buy this, buy that, and I don't want to consume this kind of product. They start to be much more sensibilized, and this is for me fundamental. And we should review also the distribution of value added across, I think, the whole food chain, because why farmers are so at least in Europe. I'm sorry, I'm talking for the continent I know best. Why farmers are so much dependent, I think, on the CAP and the subsidies, because basically the subsidy they receive, this is their income. They depend from that for living, and this is sad. This is sad. I think the public policy should be, I think, to support, I think, a transition, to facilitate the provision of information, etc., to support maybe advisory services, and that's it. But at the end of the day, I think we need to face the reality. I think the support we give them, this is their income. They depend from us, from Brussels, and I think from the CAP. So we need really to change, I think, the distribution of this value added across the whole food chain, so that farmers and also they can see the economic interest of changing practices. Second element is that, and there I would agree with Javier, I think we need to provide financial incentive to change, like eco schemes or any kind of other policy instruments to support the change. But we need also to, legally speaking, we need to forbid certain practices. And we do it, I think, through a system of conditionality. We can reinforce that, etc. But in my view, we need to forbid, I don't know, I think the plowing of peatland. We need to forbid, I think, monoculture, excessive monoculture, some type of intensive farming. I'm sorry, I'm not talking as a DG Agri, official, but I think we need, I think, to be clear about what we do not want. This is fundamental. And the last thing I would like to say is that we need to, at least for the public service, this should be the role of the public service, to invest massively in the creation, but also, and maybe I would say primarily, on the dissemination of knowledge. We know a lot. We have a lot of tools. When I speak to private companies, either input suppliers or even companies like Nestle, they have a lot of tools, that can help farmers to see the environmental impact that the product under which the product has been produced, the climate impact, etc. We need to disseminate that, to diffuse that, I think, to help farmers, I think, to understand better how to improve that, and also to help consumers when they buy your product. They know how it has been produced and what is really the cost for nature, I think, of this product. And when we will achieve that, I can tell you a lot of consumers and a lot of producers, if not most, will change behavior. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So you kind of introduced the idea of labeling foods with regenerative agriculture, potentially. Helen has just disappeared, and I was going to come to her.
No, I'm here.
Oh, you are there? No,
Yep.
Sorry, the other one, the other Helen,
Right.
Helen from Nestle, because I was going to see what she thought about that concept of labeling food with that. But anyway, yeah, other Helen, Helen Papa,
Okay.
Let's just so just pick up on that idea, yeah, a few of those different ideas around disincentives, dissemination of knowledge. So it looks like we've got 3 areas that we think policy can be most effective. Incentivizing growers, disincentivizing bad behavior, essentially, dissemination of knowledge. We do need to think about the other questions. We've got about 20 minutes left. Is there anything getting in the way? And what are some of the next steps? So in your responses next, if you can start to pick up on those questions, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'd like to bounce on that because you've really hit one of the key issues that is not necessarily discussed enough, which is leveraging knowledge and communication. Communication is education, is action, is change. And that is often left behind. There is just not enough funding that is given to actually communicating the information, to creating that circle that is communication is not just reporting on some of the information that we're getting, but it is really going back to the source of the knowledge that exists across the world in the different communities, making sure that dialogue happens so that the solutions that are applied, as I mentioned earlier, are relevant and that people feel engaged and can adapt to it. But there also needs to be a much more important effort in terms of giving visibility to the fact that, for instance, we need to diversify our crops. We cannot continue having a few major crops that are being invested in, because that is killing our capacity and in terms of soils and biodiversity. And as we see that there is more and more interest across various sectors, including across the financing sector, impact investors who are looking at ways to divert some of their fundings under the ECG type of branches that they have, but they're failing to get access, and they say this on a regular basis, to the information that allows them to build a narrative as to why they need to divert some of their funds to that particular aspect and response. So there needs to be much more of an effort to create that. Today we have technology that would allow us to have impactful knowledge sharing platforms so that communities that have practices that need to be shared, from indigenous communities, for instance, coming from the Amazon, who have amazing practices that they can share with others, needs to be leveraged at a much more global scale. And that information will then therefore impact the type of global communication and advocacy that will therefore make sense in terms of impact investment. We have to scale up regenerative agriculture practices, for instance, to protect soil health, and scaling up alternative farming practices that will leverage the power of plants to keep carbon in the soil, carbon sequestration, obviously, increase the capacity of soil to hold water, enhance the resilience of their crops, support the livelihoods of farmers, regain the nutrient density of food while decreasing reliance on synthetic inputs, developing product portfolios to boost cultivated biodiversity and increase the resilience of the food and agricultural models, eliminate deforestation, enhance the management and restoration of protection of high value natural ecosystems. There is knowledge, but we need to absolutely broaden the discussions to create global engagement. And that is not just from the top down. It is not just from multilaterals in politics going downwards. It needs to come from the bottom up. And the youth, for instance, are absolutely key in this. They want to know, they want to feel that they are actors of change and that their actions matter in response to climate, to the climate change. And that will actually get to the heart of investors who are looking to divert their investments, and it will move policy. So I think we have to make sure that our efforts are much more broadly communicated to make sure that everybody feels concerned in this.
Great, thank you so much. Oh, Nora, looks like you want to have a, sorry, Emil, we'll just let Nora speak and then Helen.
I would also like to add to this knowledge discussion, where we also need to think about integrating knowledge better into policy. So really how we can take data more seriously within policy making, especially when it comes to soil and soil degradation. And also think about how data can be used to show what works and integrate farmers into that discussion, where creating a system of governance within data collection and using that to then better and create more targeted policies, and with that also connecting to progress indicators, which are very helpful and necessary for creating better and more targeted and local policy as well. And that was my point to add.
Great. So Nora, just to iterate, data collection, that's something I missed out from like my brief summary. You think that policy and governance can play a role there, that in sort of ensuring there's enough data collection and sharing around the benefits or around how regenerative agriculture is transitioned?
Yeah, and integrating scientists and practitioners and farm us better into that progress.
Okay, Emil, I know you have something to say. I just want to come to Helen Mdina and see if you wanted to pick up on any of the previous comments. I particularly wondered what you thought about the labeling concept of labeling foods that are regeneratively grown. I know it's going on in the US already, but over in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, we're supportive of educating consumers more about this, because we are putting a lot of money and investment towards regenerative agriculture. And to do that, we're going to need to make sure that the consumers that eventually buy the products that we're buying and making into food understand why we're doing that, and why they may have to, the prices can't stay the same, right? So for us consumers, and understanding them understanding why they're getting a better product with more nutrition, why we're investing in farmers, and labeling that is clear and is well, one, it's got to be clear, but it has to have scientific measure behind it as well, in the sense that we have to understand that the labeling is actually done correctly and maybe even regulated or voluntary done, but it has to be done so that everybody understands very clearly what that is. But we are supportive of these things where consumers are educated more, because that's better for us. What I also wanted to say in this discussion was that when it comes to policy has to be coordinated amongst all the different ministries or different commission areas or whatever have you, or how different governments work. But you can't just have environmental policy in one place, food policy in another place, and social dimension, economics in a different place, and finance in a different place. What we're trying to do is make sure through a food systems approach, really figure out what does the country want to do on its climate change, on its food policy, and its social structure, and to coordinate that across. Because what we're doing now is we're working different things, and this is what's happening. Trade policy is going off in a different direction than maybe environmental policy and food policy. So one of our kind of asks is for it to be coordinated, so that we as companies understand that we're all moving in the same direction, because it's really hard to have policies go out in different directions if you're not all moving into one place. So if we want better food, more nutritious food, better food that's coming from better land, better agriculture practices that are better for the planet, then line those policies all up so that we're all moving in the same direction. And that also includes making sure that consumers are educated in the right way and that food is labeled as such.
Thank you very much. Emil, I promised I'd come to you. You wanted to pick up. You're on mute. You're on mute.
I'm sorry. On what gets in the way, I think there are also still a lot of perverse incentives. So it's not just about creating new incentives, but also removing perverse incentives. In the case of Europe, I would say that everything that is not part of the eco schemes, which is only 25% of the budget, is actually a perverse incentive because it's encouraging business as usual, and it is not providing the necessary incentive to bring about any change. As long as there are support given per hectare or per unit of production, it is actually operating as a perverse incentive, and that's why I think we have to change rapidly. I know that the negotiation of the CAP is a very tough topic with a lot of resistance, but we must go further than the 25% that we have now. And outside of Europe, there are other perverse incentives like fertilizer or input subsidies, where the money at the end of the day goes in the pocket of the companies that sell it. But the second point I wanted to make is about consumers. We've talked a lot about educating consumers and that consumers have to be drivers of change, but we must be also realistic that we can't put all the responsibility on the consumers either. Consumers live in a food environment where they are subject to what food is available in their neighborhood. And I think there's a lot of inequity, especially in poor neighborhoods, about what kind of quality food is available there. And the second one is they are very, very strongly influenced by advertising and by, the middle of the chain is wanting to sell. So I want to nuance what Pierre was saying about the role that where now it's consumers that are driving what is being produced. I agree with that to some extent, but I think we vastly underestimate the influence of food environments on what actually people eat. And that needs to be addressed as well.
Does anyone want to pick up on some of the comments? Tiglet looks like, yeah.
I would like to build on what Pierre and Helen said about the knowledge, transfer of knowledge, and sharing innovative new ideas with growers. Like if I look into the program and the opportunity working with growers, making the transition to regenerative agriculture, it is actually like promoting regenerative agriculture through carbon farming program, because we're doing nothing else than promoting planting cover crops, reducing tillage, reducing the use of chemical and synthetic fertilizer, and working with them on their individual farm system. And it makes a big difference supporting growers in this process, not only through financial resources, but also sharing knowledge and giving them a roadmap that they can follow, and then also certify their work that they have done. Because we have to also face, and I'm talking about Europe again, that they are facing requirements from all over the areas, like from society, from the consumer, from politicians, from environmental NGOs that they have to fulfill. So growers feel oftentimes overwhelmed with what they have to deliver. So sharing knowledge and accompanying them through the process, providing them with financial resources, but also with a certification that they have done good. That this gives also confidence in what they are doing, and makes them part of the solution. So if I would like to use the opportunity and to really highlight how important it is to share innovations which are available, but also the knowledge. It's not like they don't know what to do. They know best how to manage their land. But if they are like accompanied by other external advisors and professionals who give them confidence and that the way how they do it is a right way, and this is how they can transition to regenerative agriculture, that gives them even more, that activates them more to do than the next step.
So we're getting into our final 10 minutes, and Mark, do jump in now if there's certain things that you want extra clarity on for the summing up. But I think we can now go to sort of the last question. We've already started talking about this, but really try and nail down 3 to 5 actionable, feasible solutions. What are the key next steps that need to be taken to ensure policy change and governance can support the accelerated transition to regenerative agriculture? So if we go through some of the ways that we have, which we have incentives, disincentives, dissemination of knowledge, guidance to farmers, and data collection. I think some of the key ones that I've highlighted. Looking at incentives, we talked a lot about this. This is nothing new in farming. Like, what can make an incentive around this really work? What we talked about there being perverse incentives. I've referenced, in the US, that farmers aren't taking up some of these incentives. Like, what needs to make this incentives very appealing and effective from your experiences?
Jump in really quickly.
Yeah. Sorry.
Is that okay? Or Emil, do you want to go?
Just a quick one. I think sorry, I lost the thread now. I'll come back. Sorry.
Sorry, apologies. Now, just quickly, and actually to link to what Emil was saying just before that, I think that incentives, first of all, start with recognizing people's individuality and capacity to deliver. That recognition, again, in that dialogue is absolutely key. So that's one of the incentives. Another incentive is to ensure that they feel as though there is going to be a return on the investment directly to them, the farmers themselves, but at a more global level. And if you link that to even what we were discussing in terms of consumer and consumer change, it's also a question of systems changes across the world at a much broader level. Do we actually today have the time, despite the information, despite the, the solutions that are being leveraged? How many people, from the farmers to the consumers, to even the change in the production chains, how many people and how many institutions actually have the time to make that tremendous switch that we're asking them to make? It is a completely different way of living our lives. And when you see today how quickly people, how much pressure is on people to just survive on a day-to-day basis, to just make ends meet at every single level, do we have the time, even those of us who are close to the topics and who know certain things that we can start applying in our daily lives as consumers? We don't even have the time to do that. So I think that there's a broader reflection that needs to take place in terms of global system changes. And that really is very much tied to regenerative solutions. Regenerative is not just, that's the big debate between sustainable to regenerative. Sustainable is making sure that things that are already in place are evolved, whereas regeneration is deciding that actually it hasn't worked up to now. And we need to start over from scratch. We need to think of systems and recreating systems that will enable us to actually make the changes that are needed, which have not happened up to now. So I think that that's also something that is really important to include. We need to have the time to actually move from the advocacy to the solutions, the implementation.
Thank you very much. Emil, you just posted in the... Yeah.
I made my comment. Yeah, I made my comment in the chat, so I don't want to take up more time.
Perfect. Okay, Javier.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I mean, one of them is of course, in the aspect of labeling. I mean, apart from agreeing largely with Emil on the considerations he made, I think we should also be a bit careful that in places like Europe, where the organic label is already quite established and strong, that we don't shoot ourselves in the foot by creating a different label. I mean, I think that's a bit of a challenge that we need to be very careful about. And I think in that sense, I would encourage exploring where, I mean, so that we don't compete on that space of the market, but we're seeing how the regenerative agriculture approach could play a complementary role. And that's, I think, something we can look at from different scales, for industry, but also, and this is the second point I wanted to mention, is that many of you mentioned innovation, new approaches, where we get a bit more of a better added value, better recognition of what's being done. I think that one aspect that has not come up in the debate, but is worth possibly mentioning now, is that some of the places where we are seeing, at least in Europe, a lot of innovation in terms of how we approach food is at the very local level. It's in cities, food councils operating in cities, direct connections, reconnection, let's say, between citizens and producers, growers in the nearby areas. And that's something that we need to recognize, help multiply, upscale, whatever you name it. We are very used to looking at policy regulation in food-related aspects at the EU level, because that's the way we've developed in our context. One point I would like to make is would it be possible to, even if some of the aspects would continue to be regulated at the EU level, that there's more recognition, more support, a more enabling environment, so that all these more local initiatives can grow, can multiply, we can see them everywhere. Because I think it's something crucial. It's there that we are seeing a lot of the innovation. It's there that we are seeing a lot of farmers finding a different way of connecting with people. So that's something that is truly to be considered, I find, to upscale. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Any final thoughts? We have a couple of minutes. Yeah, you've been quiet recently. Yeah.
I would tend to agree with Javier on the labeling. I mean, labeling, there's a lot of labels already out there that consumers are looking at. And one of the issues for us is making sure that consumers understand and don't start getting tired of the different labels. So that's why I was really kind of cagey on my answer on this, because while we do want to inform consumers, we're going to try to get our brands to talk about it. Different brands are going to be talking to consumers directly on their practices, on their sort of sustainable and regenerative agriculture work, but they're not going to necessarily have to do it through labeling, because labeling is already, we have already a lot of stuff going on the label itself. So we're trying to, that is one of our kind of areas that we need to work on. And obviously this is why we're having this kind of discussion, is to hear more about it. But I do believe that over labeling is not the answer.
Maybe 2 words, if you allow me, Louise.
Please.
You said that I was too silent, so I'm jumping. Of labeling, I think for me, it's not providing information to consumers, educating consumers. Does not mean that it has to go through labeling. We shouldn't forget that I think we're living in a modern world in the 21st century with blockchain, with this kind of appareil. I think we can have access to a lot of information. And in my view, information available for consumers should not only concentrate on nutrition issues, they should also cover, I think, production methods. And I agree with Javier. I think a lot of development are taking place at local level, and people at local level are much more interested in the manner by which the food has been produced than by the nutritious quality of the food, because they know when they buy a certain product, they know exactly what they buy and why they buy it. And sometimes they choose to take some to go a bit off the track, I think, in order to have a bit of pleasure. But in my view, I think, but this information, I think we can have a lot of information with new technologies. The other element that I would like to come back, and Javier mentioned this en passant, was the issue of conventional agriculture, innovation, etc. And here we talk about nature positive production, and we need to see, I think, what is a border between optimizing, increasing the efficiency of conventional agriculture, like precision farming, smart farming, etc., or going to nature-based production system, which is something very different, and in terms of impact, but also this is something very different for the producers, because it's a new way of producing, and our producers are not used to that, unfortunately, because they were not taught that in schools or by training. So it's a new concept, a new approach, and we need to see how these two can really coexist in the future for the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you. I think we're about to get cut off. So thank you all so much. Mark, looking forward to you summing it up. Let me know if I can help at all with that. And yeah, I hope to see you guys over